Hey, my name is Matt Blois. I'm a reporter for FreightWaves, and I cover the healthcare supply chain. Thanks for joining me today for the Cold Chain Summit. Today I'm talking with Alex Guite. He's the VP of Services and Alliances at World Courier, which is part of the drug distributor AmerisourceBergen. The COVID-19 pandemic has put a really big spotlight on cold chain's role in the pharmaceutical industry. I think when FDA gave the first COVID-19 vaccines emergency approval last year, they needed to be transported at these really extremely cold temperatures, which attracted a lot of attention. And since then, those temperature requirements have been relaxed a little bit, at least here in the United States. But temperature control is still one of the components that makes the vaccine rollout really quite complicated across the whole world, especially here in the U.S. We've been pretty lucky to see the cold chain work fairly well, but vaccine makers and drug distributors, they still have to get those vaccine doses to the rest of the world, and the cold chain is going to be really critical for that effort. So I'm going to be talking to Alex today about how the cold chain fared during the pandemic, what that experience taught drug distributors, and maybe a little bit about how we're going to accomplish that last piece of the vaccine distribution effort to the rest of the world. So Alex, thanks so much for joining me for the event today. I really appreciate it. I want to start out by asking about sort of how the cold chain fared, because I remember I had some conversations in the fall of 2020 with some logistics providers, and they were pretty worried about how the cold chain was going to hold up when it came to vaccine distribution. They were worried about the capacity, but then once the vaccine distribution started rolling out, it seems like I've heard less about that now that it's actually happening. So I guess why didn't we hear more about that while that was happening? And then I guess going forward with as we continue to distribute the vaccine to other countries, are there capacity concerns with the rest of the vaccine rollout?
Yeah, Matt, good question, because it was certainly very interesting to see cold chain and the supply chain discussed and become a topic of conversation broadly across the news and current affairs. But as you say, it didn't turn out to be quite the issue that the industry, to some extent, was concerned about, and indeed, broader coverage would suggest that there was that concern. What it comes down to is pharma companies and logistics providers like World Courier, we've made a lot of investments pre-pandemic in order to serve the cold chain. So actually, a lot of what was asked of the supply chain during the vaccine distribution was business as usual. For example, shipping at -80 or 2 to 8. What differed though was the scale and the speed. I was talking with one pharma company who was thinking through the challenges around this time last year of distributing a vaccine that had not yet had approval, and for whom they did not know who their customers would be. And even more challenging, did not know if their customers would be a number of centralized locations in any given country, or whether or not they would be making deliveries to every potential vaccine distribution setting overall. So you potentially go from distributing to 5 or so locations in a country to 5,000, and those are very different, again, challenges that had to be planned for with a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity as well. I think the reason, as well as the fact that the day-to-day of moving at -80 is something that is well practiced by distributors and logistics providers, there was also a lot of collaboration across government agencies, pharma manufacturers and supply chain partners to kind of build up something that was rigorous but flexible and could meet the needs of the reality of distribution to regions around the world. I think something to bear in mind is that once a shipment leaves a cold storage facility, you also need the packaging to enable everyone in the supply chain to maintain a specified temperature range for days, ideally 10 days or more, to ensure the vaccines can reach the broadest patient population. Some examples I think are pretty interesting is in Norway, for example, where temperatures often get into well into the negative Celsius range during the winter months, we've been supporting with distribution of vaccines in Norway using a custom-built active container Pharmacube to maintain, in that case, a temperature range of 2 to 8 degrees. So you need to kind of make sure you've got the right packaging type for the environment in which you're going to be distributing as well. But again, that comes from the investments that logistics partners have made over the years in their supply chains. I think the other reason it was particularly calling out the speed of with which regulators and others have moved is that the widespread distribution of ultra frozen vaccines increasingly became distribution once those vaccine doses had soared, and that really relieved the pressure on ultra cold storage and indeed on parts of the supply chain that perhaps weren't so comfortable or experienced in dealing with minus 80 shipments. So I think to summarise, it was a mix of kind of investments that had been made that meant that when this test came, the capabilities were fundamentally there, but also quite a lot of collaboration in order to make it work. And as you rightly say, we're a long way into this vaccine distribution program in a number of key markets, but we've got to vaccinate the world, and some of those supply chain challenges will get perhaps more challenging as we go to different geographies. But fundamentally, again, what's got us through this first wave of distribution will get us through distribution to reach the entire global population.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I thought were interesting there. I think a lot of people were paying attention to last time this year, the development of the actual vaccines. But like you were saying, it's really interesting to think about the fact that the distributors had to start developing plans for how they're going to get these vaccines out to where they need to be without really knowing, what is this vaccine going to be like? What are the temperature requirements going to be? What's the packaging going to be? Where are they going to need to go? And so it's sort of the having to sort of make some educated guesses about what that's going to be before it happened. I feel like was one of the really big challenges. And it seems like now it's nice that we have a little more information about what the temperature ranges are, what the packaging is, and so distribution efforts going into countries that have low vaccination rates. There's at least logistics providers have more information about what's required there. So that definitely seems like a good thing. But I feel like that's a good message. My takeaway there is that the tech, that day to day, I think when I hear something like, you got to transport this at negative 80 degrees, that sounds crazy. That sounds like, whoa, that's a big deal. But you're saying, that's day to day. It's just the scale and the speed. Those were the big pieces. And so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, because I'm really interested to know. I think the pandemic has changed a whole lot of things. There was the way we did things before the pandemic happened, highlighted some ways we could do it better, and now we're going to go forward and do it differently. I feel like that's happened in so many different areas. But I'm wondering about the cold chain, because you mentioned, this is for pharmaceuticals, this is day to day. Like, this is normal. This is the way you normally do things. So, I mean, do you think the pandemic changes the way that the pharmaceutical industry is going to approach the cold chain or use the cold chain? Like, has anything changed there, or is it essentially, it just was a really big challenge, and the cold chain sort of stood up and met that challenge?
No, that's a good question. There's no doubt in my mind, actually, that the cold chain will feel different after the pandemic, or indeed already feels different. There's a number of things. There's been quite a lot of upskilling in the industry. So there were, while I talked about it as being business as usual, it certainly is business as usual for World Courier. But a lot of other parts of the logistics supply chain for whom this was new, who have upskilled and are, frankly, now capable of working in these temperature ranges. So I think for pharma companies, it's expanded the range of potential partners in the space. I also think what became really clear was that the value of the cold chain was such that it requires being taken account of early. And actually, let's be clear, it was being taken account of early, because the kind of conversations that became perhaps a bit more public in, say, November, December, and early 2021 were happening in kind of the May, June, July time period last year. But what I do think is that for cold chain professionals, particularly those working in pharma companies, the importance of their work has never been more highly recognised. And so I do think that will change some of the conversations around cold chain, and temperature requirements for moving products, I think, will less likely be an afterthought in the product development. I mean, in some cases, you probably don't get much choice. If you're moving cell therapy, probably the state of the art today is still going to be cryogenic at minus 196 Celsius, and that will remain so. But in other cases, you may have optionality, and that might drive you to make a different set of decisions in order to make distribution through the supply chain potentially easier. And I think the thing is, none of this is going away, right? Because this was cold chain pharma products, as a share was growing rapidly pre-pandemic. When you look at the kind of technology that exists within pharma, where the investment's going, the cold chain, the need for cold chain distribution is only going to increase. With a range of reports, I sometimes see figures of it going as fast as 25% over the next 3 years or so. So I think to summarise, it accelerated some things that are already in motion, as I think we can see in many aspects of our life with COVID. But it's also, I think, expanded an appreciation of the cold chain, and that will pay dividends in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like a little bit, in some cases, expanding options. Logistics providers that weren't so focused on the cold chain before are doing more of that. And it sounds like sort of internally, within organizations, just a heightened recognition of how the cold chain is important, why that's important, increased focus on that. And so your answer there is leading right to where I wanted to go, because I wanted to talk about, we've heard a lot about the cold chain because of the vaccines, but like you mentioned, there's a lot of other drugs out there that require temperature controlled environments to be shipped. And so I guess I wanted to ask about just sort of the growth there. Like I guess how much are when you look at like drug shipments, like what proportion of drug shipments are going to need cold storage now, and then if you fast forward a little bit into the future, like how much more cold transportation are we going to need, and what's behind that change?
Yeah. So I think if you look at some of the market reports, you kind of see a pharma cold chain market of around $18 to $20 billion, and then a further $70 or so billion for ambient uncontrolled shipments. So that's a lot of over-the-counter medicine, and that's not going away. And there's a lot of medicines that are can be happily shipped uncontrolled ambient. Still be effective and are well suited to their application. That's not going to change. But what is changing is that as you start seeing more and more biologics and more cell therapies and to some extent gene therapies coming through the clinical pipeline into approved products, well then that is what is at core driving the uptick in use of cold chain for pharma delivery. And of course, it's notable that a number of the vaccines that were approved were either on mRNA or DNA vaccine platforms, and the fragility of internet like that of those molecules was part of what dictated the temperature requirements for them. But of course, they're highly effective, vaccine delivery system, and it was a task given to the industry to manage the cold chain of getting those vaccines to patients. So that's broadly what's driving it. Is in some ways is the increasing use of biologics in medicine that is driving that move to cold chain. The secondary part is simply that, though, even for products that can happily be shipped uncontrolled ambient, in order to satisfy increasingly, whether it's regulators or pharma companies' own standards and requirements, many of those are starting to be shipped as a controlled temperature at ambient, so 20 degrees plus or minus X amount. So I think that's also a trend we're going to see, and that's principally driven by quality.
Yeah, that's interesting. Both looking at that drug pipeline and seeing lots of drugs coming down the pipeline that are going to need sort of that more stringent temperature control, but also thinking about quality for ones that maybe typically could conceivably be shipped at ambient temperatures. So we've only got a couple minutes left, but I want to ask really quickly before we wrap up about the influence of e-commerce on sort of drug distribution, because I know, I think that's we've seen over the pandemic, a lot of people are ordering everything you can imagine shipped directly to their house. I'm wondering, like, what does the future look like for for the cold chain with pharmaceuticals, in regards to shipping directly to consumers, or shipping to at least more, a wider variety of points of care. And I'm thinking specifically sort of like about the influence of e-commerce and the influence of having, everything readily available shipped right to your door. I mean, is that a future where we're heading to, or is that something that doesn't really make sense for drugs?
Well, I think there's elements of that future that already exist. And I think if we kind of think about e-commerce, there's a key element in there which is convenience, right? And it is appropriate and highly patient-centric to think about, are there ways that we can make it more convenient for people to participate in clinical trials? And that has, frankly, has benefits to sponsors. If you can recruit more people and retain them in your trial. If we're able to expand the range of people who are participating in a trial, it leads, frankly, to better data. So we have generally more balanced from a gender, ethnicity, and other key metrics perspective. And so we are seeing a shift of moving clinical trials away from kind of traditional sites of care into patients' homes for all of those reasons I've outlined. And actually, it was accelerated by the pandemic. We've had a well-established direct-to-patient service line for well over a decade, and we saw our volumes for that service line go up to 5x what they were pre-pandemic during kind of April, May 2020. They've reduced a bit now, but what's clear is there has been a shift towards greater use of this home healthcare model. Now, almost always what we're doing is we are meeting a nurse at the patient's home, and usually we're taking some form of infusion product, temperature controlled, and that enabled those patients to continue in their clinical trial at a time when either stay-at-home orders or healthcare capacity was redirected towards COVID treatment that meant that their trials wouldn't have otherwise continued. In more normal times, as I say, great degree of patient convenience, it expands patient access to medicine by making it more convenient to participate in a trial, either for reasons of geography or reasons of scheduling, particularly for kids, to make it more possible for them to participate in a trial around their schooling. And what we've seen as a result of the large uptick is we've seen a lot more investigators, sponsors and regulators, not just in the US but worldwide, get more comfortable with this model of clinical trial participation. So I think that's going to be a key thing that's there to stay. And linking it back to sort of e-commerce and consumerization, I think the thread that links the two is indeed the convenience of that model. And as I say, I think it's wholly appropriate, highly patient-centric way of thinking about participation in trials.
Yeah, one, and it sounds like it's really focused on that clinical trial space rather than the larger space, and it seems like that's a big part of that is making sure that the drug companies are able to enroll as many people as possible and get the best data possible. But that's all just relying on bringing that cold chain all the way to a patient's home, which is just extends it a little bit further than we'd seen previously. Yeah. Well, great, Alex. Those are the main questions I had for you today. So I really appreciated you joining me for the event today. It was great to talk to you and hear your perspective. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Great to chat.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching the event.